Chapter 9, Elf and the Mind-Brain Problem. I guess, doctor, your electricity is stronger than my will. Quote from an experimental patient in physical control of the mind toward a psycho-civilized society by Dr. Jose M.R. Delgado. We believe that our behavior is determined solely by the way our brains integrate information and present it to our consciousness. We also believe that we have the free will to choose either to obey the dictates of our information processing system or to take another action. In short, we believe that our behavior is internally generated by a process of conscious free will. The possibility that behavior is even in part determined by some unperceived external force, one that influences the operations of our brains without our knowledge, has been rejected, primarily on the basis that there is no known external force that could have any such effect. Even though such terms as consciousness and free will are quite vague, their meanings are well understood by everyone. We are conscious in the same sense that we perceive our existence, but exactly how this is done and where it occurs is absolutely unknown. If bacteria lack consciousness, where in the evolutionary sequence does it begin? There is a common tendency to view the brain as a super sophisticated computer. However, no computer has been built that displays consciousness. Hell notwithstanding. Those of us with a tinge of vitalism tend to avoid the mind-brain problem altogether, and we seek refuge in the idea that the brain is an excellent example of living organisms being more than the sum of their parts. Still, we cannot escape the fact that consciousness exists and that it poses one of the greatest challenges to human understanding. Free will is equally difficult to deal with because it is obviously part of consciousness. We consciously perceive a situation and make a choice as to the course of action we will take. It is this deliberate choosing that we equate with free will. However, our choices are not always rational, and the range of choices available to us is dictated by many external variables, such as culture and society. Nevertheless, we cherish the idea of free will and believe that freedom of choice is right of all people. I reject the idea that the brain and its workings, including consciousness, will ultimately be deciphered by computer technology, and I have some doubts that we will ever totally know the exact nature of consciousness in an objective way. However, as I am a scientist, that belief does not preclude my studying the problem. As a starting point, we already know that consciousness resides in or is associated with the operations of the brain in living organisms. If the brain is viewed as a machine, it can be separated into distinct parts, each with specific functions. I doubt that this approach will ever be of use in deciphering the problem, for it appears unlikely that there is a consciousness center. Consciousness probably resides in the total operations of the entire brain and in the systems that integrate separate parts into a functional unit. As I noted previously, in the early 1960s, I postulated that external magnetic fields could alter the basic operations of the brain by interfering with its normal internal DC electrical current system. I worked in collaboration with Dr. Howard Friedman, a psychologist at New York's Upstate Medical Center, to explore the relationship between the occurrence of the magnetic storms and the rate of admissions to psychiatric hospitals. As described earlier, we found them to be significantly related. Admittedly, the subjects of this study were persons with abnormal cognitive patterns, yet the clinical manifestation of the abnormality seemed to be exacerbated by these changes in the geomagnetic environment. In actual laboratory experiments conducted later, we exposed normal human volunteers to controlled magnetic fields and measured their reaction times. We found that DC magnetic fields as strong as 15 Gauss had no effect on reaction time, but that significant and very different effects were produced by exposure to much smaller fields, modulated at 0.1 or 0.2 Hertz. These extremely low frequencies are present in the micropulsations of Earth's normal geomagnetic field, but are much lower in strength than the main components, where center about 10 hertz. I concluded that there was some relationship between the ELF and the normal geomagnetic field, either gross disturbances such as magnetic storms or more subtle alterations such as changes in the relative strength of micropulsation frequencies and the measurable activities of the human brain. I outlined our theory in a series of presentations and publications in 1962 and 63. We concluded that the magnetic field of Earth is an important physiologic factor for living organisms. It appears that behavioral changes of an undesirable nature, either quite evident or subtle, may result from exposure to environments having lower or higher field strengths than normal, or those having either no fluctuation or cyclic fluctuation at frequencies other than those to which we are adjusted. At that time, the primary scientific endeavor was manned spaceflight, and I cautioned that beyond 250,000 miles out in space, astronauts would be exposed to a magnetic field that was much lower in strength and that lacked the normal fluctuations found on Earth's surface. I suggested that experiments should be done before the space flights to make sure that no subtle psychological alterations would occur that could degrade the astronauts' performance. As a result of these comments, I was contacted by Dr. James Hammer of Northrop Space Laboratories, who informed me that this group was already involved in this area. He also noted that Dr. Norbert Weiner of MIT, the originator of the cybernetics, had been interested in the same subject. Weiner had been involved in a German experiment in which human volunteers were unknowingly exposed to low-intensity 10 hertz electrical field. The subjects reported feelings of unease and anxiety when the fields were turned on. Both Hammer and Weiner were working under the assumption that ELF internal rhythms in the brain were determinants of behavior, and that pulsing external fields could drive these internal rhythms, thereby altering behavior. I corresponded with Dr. Hammer for several years, providing him with the data obtained in my lab. However, I never received any data from his experiments. In 1963, I was contacted by Dr. Dietrich Beecher of the Naval Surface Weapons Laboratory in Silver Springs, Maryland, who was engaged in the extensive project on human volunteers. Beecher was testing the effect of people of long periods of exposure to a zero magnetic field. I visited his lab and found that he was able to completely null out the Earth's DC magnetic field, but not the micropulsation frequencies. Therefore, his subjects were not completely cut off from the normal fluctuating components of the natural geomagnetic field. Beecher measured many psychological variables during the project, including those involving psychological factors. When the experiment had been concluded and the data analyzed, Beecher told me that except for some major psychological variables, no effect had been found. The experiment could now be redone with both the Earth's steady field and the micropulsations fully nulled out. Weiner's report of the restoration of normal biological cycles under his condition through the introduction of simple 10 hertz field could then be checked. However, it appeared that my concept of a relationship between the normal variations in the Earth's geomagnetic field and the human behavior was taken seriously by at least certain elements of scientific community. At the time, their primary interest in this area had to do with possible hazards during space travel. The deeper biological and physiological implications were not considered. During the same period of the 1960s, these implications were being taken quite seriously by another scientist, Spanish neurophysiologist Dr. Jose M.R. Delgado, whose study of birth defects in chicken embryos exposed to ELF was described earlier. Was interested in the physiological basis of behavior and emotions. He confirmed and extended chance observations that had been made a decade earlier indicated the possible existence of a pleasure center in the brain. Electrical stimulation of brain and behavior, the question of free will. Delgado was able to demonstrate unequivocally that minute electrical currents administered through electrodes implanted in the brain of humans and animals produced highly specific emotional and behavioral responses, depending upon the specific part of the brain stimulated. Delgado was a superb showman, and in his most famous demonstration, he stopped a charging bull in its tracks by using a radio signal sent from a handheld transmitter to a receiver implanted in the bull's head. The TV tape of his exposition was shown around the world. Delgado discovered the exact parts of the brain in which electrical stimulation produced fear, anxiety, pleasure, euphoria, or rage in human subjects. He found that certain sites produced major personality alterations. For example, stimulation of one such site could cause very proper, reserved young ladies to become flirtatious and sexually aggressive. Other sites inhibited maternal or aggressive behavior. In short, Delgado was able to profoundly alter human behavior through electrical stimulation of discrete areas of the brain. He promoted the use of this technique for producing desirable behavior in psychiatric patients. When he used the technique on patients who were not too emotionally ill to be unaware of what was happening, they reported that their behavior had changed not because they had wanted to, but because they had been unable to overcome the power of the electrical signal. This work ultimately led to experiments in which electrodes were implanted in the pleasure centers of rats' brains. The animals were provided with two levers to press. One of these delivered food and the other produced electrical stimulation of the pleasure center. Invariably, the rats chose to press the lever that stimulated the pleasure center, even to the extent that they died of starvation. The experiments, which were widely reported, were viewed as being demeaning to the animals and, by implication, to human beings. Delgado's work was viewed with open hostility and outrage by the scientific community. These opinions were strengthened by the publication of his book, Physical Control of the Mind Toward a Psycho-Civilized Society, in which he summarized his experiments and his conclusions. To Delgado, the mind existed only in the brain. To postulate its existence as an independent entity was sheer nonsense. He rejected the cherished concept of free will, and he proposed that the mind was a functional entity produced by the electrical operations of the brain. As such, it could and should be manipulated by external means. Because the brain controls the whole body and all mental activities, electrical stimulation of the brain could possibly become a master control of human behavior by means of man-made plans and instruments. To discuss whether human behavior can or should be controlled is naive and misleading. We should discuss what controls are ethical, considering the efficiency and mechanisms of existing procedures and the desirable degree of these and other controls in the future. Delgado was viewed as promoting human mind control, and his book evoked a storm of protest. Apparently, the mechanistic concept of life works as long as it is not extended into such areas as consciousness, mind, and free will. In the early 1960s, I became aware of the work of Dr. H.J. Campbell and of the Institute of Psychiatry at D. Crespigny Park in London. Campbell was disturbed by Delgado's demonstration of the power inherent in the pleasure center of the brain, and particularly by its terrible compulsiveness, as revealed by the rat experiments. He viewed the use of electrodes and internal stimulation as unnatural, and he asked an important question: how do the pleasure areas become activated in normal life? Through a long series of experiments, Campbell concluded that all new sensory input could stimulate the brain's pleasure centers. His experiments involved providing animals with a way to turn on a stimulus, such as a light, or in the case of aquatic animals, a mild electrical current in the water. He found that initially the animals behaved as though the activity that turned on the stimulus was directly connected to the pleasure center. The aquatic animals, for example, would repeatedly swim through the stimulating apparatus. However, the activity did not continue for long. After passage of time, it slowed and finally stopped. In other words, the animals became satisfied and no longer felt the need for such sensory input. This was quite different from direct electrode stimulation of the pleasure center. Campbell postulated that as the nervous system evolved and became more complex, there was an accompanying need for the pleasure center to be kept activated by sensory stimuli. He went on to propose that the sensory inputs required for lower animals were simpler and less complex than those for humans. Finally, he suggested that evolution was still progressing and that humans would slowly lose the need for sensory stimuli to activate the pleasure center. In its place, they would acquire the ability to activate the pleasure center themselves simply by exercising the capacity for thought and use the sense organs as ancillaries to mental phenomena. Campbell envisioned a utopian society that would be based solely on the pleasures of rational thinking, a view diametrically opposed to Delgado's. I was interested in Campbell's work because of my own work on the salamander nervous system and its electrical activity. At the time, there was a growing interest in so-called electrosensing by aquatic animals. And some researchers were beginning to think that this was a mechanism by which the animals found food in their water environment. In that light, I wondered whether Campbell's animals had simply been looking for something to eat. Would a well-fed salamander swim back and forth through the stimulator? It also struck me that the animals did not stay in the stimulating apparatus, but rather they had to swim continuously back and forth through it to obtain gratification. The fact that the electrical stimulus used by Campbell was a direct current suggested to me that the actual stimulus was ELF pulses of electricity that resulted from the animal's repeat passage through the apparatus. Unfortunately, my letters to Dr. Campbell were not answered, and I could not locate any of his reports in scientific literature. While I gave up on these questions, it seemed to me that his basic idea that normal stimulation of the pleasure centers was via sensory input was correct. After all, neither human beings nor other organisms were equipped with electrodes embedded in the limbic region of the brain. Nevertheless, Campbell's experimental results suggested to me another important conclusion, one that he had missed. Low-frequency pulsing electrical fields could serve as sensory inputs for living organisms. Hamer, Beischer, and I were looking for external fields that could influence behavior, while Delgado and others attacked the problem directly by electrically stimulating the brain. We all learned something. I believe that Delgado, no matter how one views his work, learned the most. Later, he continued with his work in such a fashion as to bring the two lines of investigation together. Low-frequency magnetic stimulation of brain and behavior. Since the mid-1970s, Delgado has been director of the premier Spanish neurophysiological laboratory, Centro Ramon y Cajal. His interest has shifted from direct electrical stimulation of the brain to the broader area of the biological effects of electromagnetic fields. He has studied the influence of specific frequencies of magnetic fields on the behavior and emotions of monkeys, without using any implanted electrodes or radio receivers. While Delgado did not publish any of his work in the scientific journals, its existence leaked out. In 1984, his lab was visited by a friend of mine, Kathleen McAuliffe, then an editor at Omni magazine. She was able to observe some of the experiments, and her impressions were subsequently published in the February 1985 issue of Omni. Using very low-strength ELF magnetic fields, Delgado could deliberately produce either sleep or manic behavior in monkeys when the experimental circumstances would normally call for only alertness on their part. In other experiments, he was able to change the effects of actual electrical stimulation of one of the emotional centers of the brain by pre-treating the animal's head with another ELF magnetic field. As Delgado noted, the electrical currents produced within the brain by exposure to fields were hundreds of times lower in intensity than those required to electrically stimulate a nerve cell or those used for direct electrode stimulation. Unfortunately, we do not know whether the specific frequencies were always productive of certain behaviors or whether there were other factors involved. McAuliffe was allowed only to peek behind the curtain. Most of the questions I had asked her to put to him remain unanswered. The mechanist concept of the brain is essentially that of hardwired system, but one that could alter its wiring patterns through learning and experience. In this system, information is carried only by the nerve impulse, which is basically the same whether it is transmitting vision, hearing, or information between parts of the brain. The different sensations are the results of signals that are routed from specific organs to specific regions of the brain. A system such as this, based solely on a single type of signal, could not be perturbed by exposure to ELF fields of the extremely low strength used by Delgado. The ELF field could change the operations of pineal glands and possibly the magnetic organ, but the changes would be reflected in alterations in chemical messengers, such as melatonin and serotonin. Behavioral or emotional changes would take considerable time to develop. It is obvious that ELF fields do not alter the operation of the visual system. For example, standing directly under a 60 Hertz high voltage power line does not produce any visual sensation at all, except for the gross actions of hearing the hum of the line and possibly noting the static charges developed on the skin. There would be no effect on other system components. On the other hand, exposures to power frequency fields do produce depression and other symptoms, but only after long exposure and very likely via the pineal melatonin link. It is impossible to explain any of the ELF effects on the basis of perception of the field. Likewise, Delgado observations of prompt alterations in behavior following exposures to low strength ELF fields cannot be explained by the slow chemical response of the pineal. The link between ELF electromagnetic fields and the mind must lie deeper, perhaps in the ancient internal DC system sketched out in the modest detail in Chapter 2. Low frequency radiation and altered consciousness. The DC system contains ELF oscillations that seem to be associated with information flow, and its operations are sensitive to external low frequencies. The overall level of consciousness is regulated by a DC current flow in the primitive midline structures in the brain. Loss of consciousness can be produced by nulling out or reversing this flow with properly applied external DC currents or strong, steady magnetic fields. There appears to be a roughly linear relationship between the extent of consciousness loss, as judged by the EEG pattern, and the amount of electrical current applied. In the 1960s, I studied the effect on consciousness of the addition of various ELF frequencies to a baseline DC current. I found that for any current level, a greater loss of consciousness could be produced if I added a very low strength 1 Hertz frequency on top of the DC current.